From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. I'm Nick Barris. It is a Wednesday. We've got a good show on tap for you. Invite you, as always, to join in the conversation. We'll get the phone lines up there in a moment. And this morning, we're going to talk about politics and terrorism, if you will, or national security. And this in light of the fact that we have our conventions going on. One just wrapped up, and the other one about halfway through, with the Republican convention passing, and now the Democrats on their way this week. Of course, you've got your nominees already in place. Hillary nominated yesterday, Donald Trump last week. Against that backdrop, we continue to see violence, certainly some here in this country, and we can debate whether some of the incidents obviously involving law enforcement officers are of a terrorist type activity or something more. We can get into that, but certainly some of the things that we've seen overseas as well. And that is going to be part of whatever the next president is going to have to deal with, and the policies and what can be done and what our observations are about all that, and whether or not you feel secure and what you're looking at. The number 737-7587 is the number if you want to join in the conversation, but it's not going to be just me and you. It's going to be a professor from Vanderbilt, Professor Thomas Schwartz. Good morning to you,
morning,
sir.
Nick.
It's good to see you again. You're wearing a corduroy jacket, and it's going to be 95 degrees. You are out of control, but it looks great. But how do you do it? Man, it's hot, but thank you for coming on. All right, what's your take on this? You take a look at what's happening against the political backdrop right now, and we haven't heard a ton yet about, and I think we're going to get a lot of it during the debates, the questions the candidates get on security and what's going on. But, I mean, does the role of this security and some of these terrorist attacks, even the ones we see in Europe, have a play in politics here?
Of course. I mean, they're centrally, the Republican candidate, Donald Trump, tried to frame his picture of America in terms of the violence and the violence in the world.
Painted an ugly picture.
That it's out of control. And so I think any type of violence and disorder and terrorism feeds that narrative. And the Democrats, for their part, have painted a much rosier picture. They haven't even talked about ISIS the first two nights of the convention. They've stayed away from that. And I think, in a way, the campaigns may end up talking about different things on this issue.
Yeah, certainly. Different. Well, obviously, now, the Democrats, and with a sitting Democratic president, they're going to try to make the case that the fight against ISIS and terrorism is going well, or they're doing, they're taking steps to do it, whereas, of course, the challenges are going to say not so hot. Now, what about the recent cases, especially, most recently in France, all right, that have made headlines, and ISIS has taken responsibility for some of the issues, in Nice, and then the priest in the church getting his throat slit and all of that. How does that play in your mind?
Well, I think it plays more, it certainly feeds the larger view in the United States. Now, granted, France is in Europe, it's not the United States, but we've seen all of these things on iPhone videos. The Nice attack had a stunning effect. So I think there's an awareness and a sense that this could happen here, or at least a perception that it could happen here. And so to a certain extent, when attacks are happening in France, and interestingly enough, Trump said that because France is now becoming such a center of terrorism, we might have to screen visitors from France to the United States, or immigrants coming from that region, much more carefully. So I do think it plays into a larger view of a sort of terrorism coming closer to our shores, or in fact being able to affect us personally in a way that might not have been the case in the past.
I wonder if candidates, especially a candidate like Trump, takes a look at France and thinks about the whole refugee issue, coming in there. And of course, he's spoken out very strongly about really limiting and watching and vetting whoever comes into this country. And so if Americans here see things like this happening in a country like France that may, and I'm not exactly certain about what their policy is with regard to refugees, though I know they have them coming in.
They've had many more than us.
And so if you point to that and say, well, there's a direct correlation.
Yes. Yeah. No. And in fact, the other attacks that took place in Germany, for example, recently, the axe attack on a train that took place, and these attacks. Germany, of course, has been the open border for immigrants. Chancellor Merkel actually went out of her way to invite Syrian immigrants in. So it is part of, it can be placed as part of a narrative that, look what happened to Europe, it could happen to us.
Yeah.
So that is, it's something of a warning sign Trump could use as a way of heightening fears about immigration, crime, terrorism, which were all bundled together in his speech as in presenting his own sense of why things are so badly wrong and why they have to be changed.
How do you, if we can step back, kind of define some type of incident as terrorism? If not, obviously if ISIS takes responsibility, I guess it gets into that category. Now, unfortunately, we've had plenty of acts of violence, and most recently, at least in Japan, that horrible knife attack that claimed so many lives at a facility for the disabled, and it doesn't appear as though that was necessarily a terrorist attack. You heard the crazy rationale the lunatic that did that said was something about, you know, almost as though these folks were a burden on society, let's wipe them out, or something stupid like that. But does that, what qualifies as a terrorist attack? Certainly some of the case, the ambush in Dallas of the police officers, you know, possibly in reaction to some of these shootings involving, you know, police and African Americans. Well, where does the line get drawn in your mind?
I think the line gets drawn in part by what we end up wanting to call an act like that. The act in Japan was a crazy person, but possessed of a type of view of the disabled that obviously we don't accept. There was a shooting in Germany by a native-born but of Iranian extraction German young person who killed a lot of teenagers, but he killed them. He may have been imitating the Norwegian mass murderer of a couple of years ago. He did it on the anniversary of that date, and he didn't have any ties to ISIS. So in some ways, direct ties to ISIS claiming responsibility probably is the criteria for claiming it as a direct act of terrorism. But the Dallas shootings show that terrorism can also have a domestic form. We've had domestic terrorism in this country. We had the blowing up of the Oklahoma City federal building. So we've had domestic terrorism. We also now have international terrorism. Something of a political motive is usually the key to calling something a terrorist act.
I'm glad you defined that. I think because people are going to say, so because certainly ISIS has not, you know, cornered the market on terrorism. So in your mind, terrorism to get, as opposed to maybe a mass murder of some type, terrorism would be that there's a political motivation or something striking at not just these individuals for a purpose, but for a larger picture.
That's right. And the where it gets complicated is that ISIS seems to draw on people who've had either disappointments, setbacks in their life, suffer from mental illness, and that. So it draws in people who are alienated from the society, and so you might, in another context, see them as the actions of a mentally ill person, but in the fact that ISIS will claim, and some of them will in fact announce their support for ISIS, it turns into a terrorist attack. ISIS is an unusual terrorist organization in that it has had in the past both centrally controlled terrorist attacks, and then it has these lone wolf inspired attacks. So it has both. Yeah, and we've seen some of that even in this country, where they don't have any direct link that anyone's been able to ascertain to ISIS, but that they've observed some of these attacks, and then in these lunatics' own writings on their computers, once they get the hardware, they see, oh, well, they were kind of making reference to what they've observed and said, well, that's inspiration to me. Well, social media, the internet allows for instant communication across borders in a way that would have been harder in much earlier times. It wouldn't have had the same direct effect, the idea of being inspired by a terrorist group that exists essentially online and that does videos and that does inspirational arguments online in a way that is totally different from what would have been in the past. Would you agree that some of these parties, like ISIS and the others, they're obviously well aware of the fact that there are conventions and a political election going on for a president in this country now? And thankfully, we've not seen any violence involving them or anything like that at any of these conventions, and security's in place. Do you think ISIS gives a hoot who our next president is? No, of course not. Of course not. It doesn't matter. If you're American, they're going to be. No, the argument, I think ISIS's motivations for acting now have more to do with the pressure that's being placed on them by the military campaigns going on in Iraq, particularly the airstrikes, and the attempt in some ways to show that they are still an active organization despite having lost some ground. Yeah. All right. On that note, let's take a break. When we come back, Cindy, Brian, Greg, and others, you're on hold. We'll get to your phone calls. Again, your comments, your thoughts. We're in a political season right now. We've got a lot of this violence happening both domestically and overseas, much of it terrorism, and how it all plays in together. Politics, national security, which is very important to all of us. We'll be back with more and your calls right after this.